For anybody who's new, my name's Frank Huntington. I live over on the other side of town in Thorndike Gardens. And on Saturday will be my 3rd anniversary living here. Yeah, it was a very good choice. Very good choice. Okay, so we seem to be at 1:30. I put the lecture schedule up there for you. It's pretty consistent with Thursdays at 1:30, except for the very last week. We do have a break in May. I'm not sure why, but we have a week off where we couldn't get this room. And, you look at the list of topics. I apologize. This is probably not going to be a really cheerful series of lectures. I promise to try to try to do something a bit more light and more of a diversion in the fall to help us not think about the election campaign. I'm sure we're all going to need a distraction from that. Okay, so why am I here, and why did I pick these topics? It seems to me, I think it's fair to say that the whole concept of democratic government, what Abe Lincoln called the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that kind of government is under attack in a lot of places in the world today, not just here, but elsewhere. And so without getting philosophical, because I'm not one, I thought I wanted to talk a bit about what it takes to have a successful democracy. And since I'm a historian, the most natural thing for me to do is to pick some examples where democratic government failed in truly terrible ways. And I think there are some lessons we can draw from those unfortunate examples. I'm starting today with World War I because, it's over 100 years now. People forget it, but it is directly the trigger for the Russian Revolution, Mussolini and the rise of fascism in Italy, and Hitler and the success of the Nazis in Germany. It led directly to all 3 of those. After that, moving forward in time a bit, talk about the Cold War, which was certainly pitched to everyone as totalitarianism versus democracy, and try to unpack a bit what that means. And then the war on terror and the effect that's had on our democracy and others. And I may just wander off into the contemporary issues at the end of that lecture. We'll see how brave I feel. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so to understand, and I should apologize. I bring my lectures over, the slides over on a little thumb drive, and the one that I loaded onto the thumb drive was not, in fact, the final version. I was tinkering with it up until an hour and a half ago. So I may be thrown off by seeing something up there I wasn't expecting to see, but you'll be charitable. Okay, so to understand World War I, you have to start with what Europe looked like in 1914. And, there are a couple of obvious things that jump out at you if you look at that map. There's something big called the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the center of Central Europe and Eastern Europe. You won't see any Poland. Poland had been carved up by Austria, Russia, and Prussia back actually in the 18th century, and there hadn't been an independent Poland for quite a long time. The Ottoman Empire was still ruling in Istanbul, Constantinople, and had all of today's Turkey and a portion on the European side of the straits, that lead from the Black Sea out to the Mediterranean. If you have really sharp eyes, you would notice that France doesn't look quite the right size because the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine belonged to Germany at the time. So there's the northeast corner of France is a little smaller than it should be. And you'll notice that the European countries dominate the whole northern coast of Africa. Between France and Algeria, Italy has Libya, the British ran Egypt. And it's really safe to say that Europe ruled the world on the eve of the First World War. I mean, it's hard for us to kind of imagine that. Europe's a pretty small corner of the world when you look at it on a map, but somehow through its technology and superior weapons, the Europeans during the 19th century had managed to gobble up through colonies a good large portion of the world. The British Empire by itself was the largest empire in history. When you combine the dominions like Canada and Australia that are in red, and then the colonies that are in pink, Britain controlled nearly a quarter of the people on the planet. The most important colonies for the British were India and Egypt, because Egypt controlled the Suez Canal, which is the way to get out to Egypt if you're coming from Europe. France governed Algeria, yeah, that's in dark blue, and had a whole lot of colonies in Western Africa that are in light blue. Belgium, in olive green there, owned the Congo. Holland, tiny little Holland, controlled what is now Indonesia and New Guinea. Portugal and Germany had a few colonies. The Ottoman Empire controlled most of the Middle East. It's hard to see on the map because they're small, but even the United States had colonies. Right at this point, we control Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. And the areas in white that are truly independent is basically South America and China. Now, the Europeans thought of themselves as the absolute apex of civilization at the beginning of the 20th century. And it is truly a glorious period for Western culture. I found some fun paintings. These were all painted within about 10 years of the First World War. And you've got Picasso, Braque, Marc Chagall running across the top, Matisse and Kandinsky running along the bottom. It's an era for some amazing music, Debussy, Ravel, Richard Strauss, Mahler, a whole lot, some amazing music, and some amazing literature. Proust, James Joyce was getting started. The Europeans really... That is not part of my presentation. That's okay. So the Europeans really thought of themselves as the cream of civilization, and they enjoyed looking down on America as sort of a country cousin that was not quite as civilized. And Europe was governed, virtually every country in Europe except for France was governed by a king or a queen. And thanks to those two people, pretty much all the kings and queens were related. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had 9 children and 42 grandchildren, and almost all of them ruled somewhere or were married to somebody who ruled somewhere. Family resemblance? That is Tsar Nicholas II on the left, King George V in the center, and Kaiser Wilhelm II on the right, and they are all cousins because they're all Victoria's grandkids. One of the things that I think led the European countries to believe that they were safe from war for the foreseeable future was that they're all related. They all summer together. They go. Wilhelm entertains these other folks on his yacht. There's a lot of anyway. It helped boost their confidence that they were truly running the world. But fear of potential war had led the major countries in Europe into alliances, and so you've got 2 of them, one in the center, one on the extremes, and the point of each alliance was defensive. We will help you if you are attacked by one of the other countries in a different color. The major threat to the stability of this European system was Austria-Hungary. That is a map that attempts to capture the ethnic groups in Austria-Hungary. The people who run the place are the Austrian Germans, who are in red, and the Hungarians, who are in green. But look, there's so many other ethnic groups. The Czechs running across the top, the Czechs in the light blue, Slovaks in the brown, Poles in purple, and Ukrainians in gold on the upper right. And down below that, you've got some Italians in yellow, the Slavs, which is a lumping together, the Croats, the Serbs, the Bosnians, they're all in tan, and you've even got some Romanians in orange on the east. A lot of those groups within Austria-Hungary were frustrated at not having enough of a political role. It really was an Austro-Hungarian empire. They ran the government, they controlled the languages that were used at schools. The others had very little political clout. Now, who was governing Austria-Hungary? Well, that man on the left there is Emperor Franz Joseph. He was 83 in 1914. He had been ruling for 65 years. I actually Googled it today because I was curious. Queen Elizabeth, who recently passed away, was the longest ruling monarch on the list, but this Franz Joseph comes in second or third. It's a long time on the throne. His heir was his nephew, Franz Ferdinand there. He was 50. By Austrian standards, Franz Ferdinand was liberal and actually was willing to grant some degree of autonomy to the other ethnic groups in the country. Now, even within Austria-Hungary, there's a real trouble spot, and that is the Balkans. They've been a trouble spot in world history for a very long time. You had a lot of independent kingdoms. There was Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, Montenegro, and then the portion of the Balkans ruled by the Austro-Hungarians. Now, if you're looking at that map, Serbia, right there in the center, is the cause of the trouble because they want to stir up political agitation within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they particularly, I hope you can see the name Bosnia there, in the center left. The Serbs really want to gobble up Bosnia because there are a lot of ethnic Serbs who live there. The fateful day for this is June 28th, 1914. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie traveled to Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia, on a goodwill trip. Bosnia is technically part of the empire. They were assassinated by the fellow in the upper right there, Gavrilo Princip. I'm sure I mangled that. He was a Bosnian who wanted to liberate the Slavic peoples from Austrian rule. And so he manages to shoot both of them. And you'll notice from the headlines on the right there, different views about what this means. You've got one paper saying, it might change politics. You've got one saying, well, this removes any chance of war. And you've got another one saying, this is going to lead to war. The fact is nobody knew. But within 6 weeks, all of Europe was at war. And how in the world did that happen? Well, the Austro-Hungarians began investigating, and it was really easy to determine that Princip there and his co-conspirators had been financed and armed by the Serbian government. This was not quite a political assassination of one country against another, but pretty darn close. And the leaders in Austria-Hungary decided, we've had enough. Serbia has been a pain for us for a while. This horrible assassination is clearly the last straw. We have got to take care of them. And because they're in an alliance with Germany, which was a much stronger country, they go to the Germans and say, we kind of like to teach the Serbs a lesson. Is that okay? And the German leaders basically say back to them, yeah, don't worry. We have your back. Nothing bad's going to happen. And the German leaders were truly not afraid of a war because of what they assumed would happen is that Austria-Hungary would wipe out Serbia very quickly and the whole thing would be over fast. So, Austria-Hungary delivers an ultimatum. One thing you may notice in those headlines is back in 1914, English papers spelled it with a V, Servia. Not Serbia, but that's the country we're talking about. So they send a list of demands to Serbia, and they assume that the Serbs will reject the demands, and then they'll be able to just go in and teach them a lesson. The Serbs came really close to accepting everything that Austria-Hungary asked. The Austro-Hungarian foreign minister said that Serbia's response was the most skillful, the most brilliant example of diplomatic skill he had ever seen. They came really close, but they couldn't accept. Austria-Hungary wanted to send its own law enforcement people into Serbia, do its own investigation, and arrest and try anybody that they found. And that would be such an invasion of Serbia's sovereignty that the Serbs had to say no to that. Austria declares war. That's the actual telegram that they used to inform the Serbs that they were under attack. And you could see some happy Austrian soldiers there, figuring this is going to be a nice, quick little venture. And it could have been a simple war. It could have just been Austria-Hungary goes in, teaches the Serbs a lesson, comes back, and it's all over. It could have gone that way, but it didn't. And for this, we have to now look to Russia. As you can see from that map, Russia has a border with Germany, with Austria-Hungary. The Russian rulers, the czars, had long considered themselves the protectors of the Slavic peoples in Europe, and Slavic being a kind of general label for a number of different ethnic groups. So when Austria declared that it was going to wipe out Serbia, the Russians felt they had to step in to protect this Slavic people from aggression from the outside. So they began to mobilize their troops. And that's a big deal. You got to try to imagine, being a military planner in this period and imagining how do you go to war against these your neighbors. Every country is going to have an army that in the millions. They all have to move from somewhere to somewhere else. They either have to go by road in trucks or they have to go on a railroad car. The mobilization is a massive effort to get people in uniform and get them transported to the front. And that takes real planning to not have massive traffic jams. So the military leaders in each country had their mobilization plans that they had to stick to avoid chaos. And if you look at that map, you can see that Russia always assumed if it was ever in war, it would be at war with both of those countries, Germany and Austria. So the only mobilization plan they had was to go to war against both of them. Now, at this point, Germany hasn't declared war on anybody, but the Russians can't help it. They have to mobilize and start sending their soldiers up to the border with Germany. And the Germans can't give the Russians a head start, so they issue an ultimatum to Russia: stop the mobilizing or else. And when the Russians couldn't stop because it would have been too risky for them militarily to stop, Germany declared war on Russia. Even here, the war could have been just Germany and Austria fighting Russia, the rest of Europe not involved, but it didn't work out that way. And for that, on some level, we have General von Schlieffen to thank. There he is. Again, it's military planning. The German military people all assumed, because of the alliances, they would have to fight both France on their west, and Russia on their east. They would be fighting two fronts. And their theory was, Russia's big, it's disorganized, it's going to take them 6 weeks to get their army ready. So what we need to do is beat France within 6 weeks. And so that general there, Alfred von Schlieffen, developed a plan to swoop in, and since the French army was along the Rhine River with the actual German border, von Schlieffen says, well, what do? We just sweep through Belgium, get them from the north, and he had meticulous timetables for the railroads of how they were going to move their troops and capture Paris within 6 weeks. He was sure of it. Now, to do that to get to France, they have to go through Belgium, the Germans. So the Germans very nicely say, Belgium, do you mind if we send our army through? We promise to leave when it's all over. Don't worry, but we just need to march right through your country. The Belgians, not surprisingly, said, no way. And so Germany has to declare war on Belgium and starts to invade. And now people start looking to Great Britain. What are they going to do? Are they going to sit on the sidelines? And the British have several reasons to not sit on the sidelines. They had signed a treaty years and years earlier guaranteeing the independence of Belgium. So they kind of had a treaty that said they had to help. And they're also just really afraid of what happens if Germany wins. Germany could be so powerful, dominating the continent of Europe, that it would be really risky for British security. So they go to war too. 6 weeks, and you now have most of the countries of Europe at war with each other. That map shows the final alignment. At the very last minute, Italy decided to switch sides. It thought it would get a better deal in the long run fighting alongside Britain and France than it would sticking with the others. The Ottoman Empire got involved because they wanted to get some land away from Russia. Although the Netherlands and Belgium are shown as neutral on that, they were actually occupied by the Germans. And you only have a few countries in purple there that are independent. This is still the era of gas lights. If you think about city streets, what a London street looked like in 1914, basically a lot of gas lights. And the British Foreign Minister, Sir Edward Grey, told a colleague when they had gotten to this point, the lamps are going out all over Europe. We will not see them lit again in our lifetime. And he was kind of right. Now, one big question when this is happening is, what is the working class going to do? And again, this may, we forget, but in the early 20th century, Karl Marx was still a big deal. And there were so strong socialist parties in most of the countries of Western Europe. Britain had a labor union or focused party, the Labour Party. And Karl Marx had declared way back in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And it was standard Marxist doctrine that the working class in each country has more in common with the working class in other countries than it does with the capitalists in their own country. Basically, the Socialist Party representatives met just a couple weeks while the ultimatum was being delivered and voted that in an event of war, all the working class in each country would stay home and lobby for peace. They would not cooperate with the war effort. And it turned out that was totally wrong, because as soon as people start declaring war, the Socialist Party in each of the countries rallies to the national cause. They're not going to be left out. They're not going to make it harder for their nation to fight for its survival. And so the idea that Marxism and socialism would lead to peace in the event of a big war goes up in smoke. Not true. A few things to think about for this. Those are all happy people cheering that their nation is going to war. Those are photos from different countries, and I can't give you I no longer remember which is from where, but they're all happy. And there had not, how is that possible? There had not been a major war in Europe for 100 years. Since the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, there had only been a few small wars like the Crimean War. They did not know what they were getting into. Most people, and I mean both civilians and the military leaders, all assumed it would be over by Christmas. Each country assumed its army was so good it would just go charging through the other side, capture their capital, and the boys would be home by Christmas. And, as we know, that did not happen. It did not work out the way they had expected. On the Western Front, the General Schlieffen's plan almost worked. The German army looped through Belgium and got really close to Paris. They could see the spires of of Notre Dame in the distance. That's how close they had gotten. But the British and the French dug in, stopped them, and then pushed them back. So that purple line is as far as they got. They got pushed back. I hope the colors show up from where you're sitting. The red line that runs from the North Sea all the way to Switzerland is where the troops ended up by the end of the fall of 1914. So everybody dug trenches. And for the next 3 years, they slaughtered each other on the Western Front at an amazing rate, and the front hardly moved. A few miles once in a while, back and forth. While all this was happening, each of the country's governments was flooding the civilian population with propaganda about how this is a war for the national survival, this is a war for the survival of civilization. There was an enormous amount of propaganda devoted to making your country's cause the only possible correct cause, and the enemy into demons of one form or another. And the slaughter was really unbelievable. The biggest battle in the American Civil War was Gettysburg. It lasted 3 days, and there were 50,000 casualties. The Battle of the Somme on the Somme River lasted 4 months, and there were more than 1 million casualties. The Battle of Verdun, at the same time, during 1916, lasted most of the year and another 1 million casualties. The French actually have a mass grave at Verdun where there are about 150,000 French soldiers who they couldn't identify and just left them buried in the mud. It's a military cemetery today. And so many people were dying that it made it pretty much impossible for any of the governments to think about a compromise to end the war. Each country had invested so much manpower, so much blood into the effort that they had to fight for total victory. And it's hard to imagine what life was like for the soldiers. And I want to focus on this a bit because the people who survived this war are going to have a big role to play in the Russia, Italy, and Germany over the next few weeks of this class. So the trenches are just holes in the mud. You couldn't, along the Belgian border, you couldn't dig more than a couple of feet without hitting water. So they're constantly having to get the water out of their trenches. There's mud everywhere. There's rats everywhere. In fact, if you'll notice on the lower left there, those are rats that have been captured and killed by the little dog that somebody's holding. And I found there are a whole lot of pictures that look like that I found on the internet. There's lice. Everybody's suffering from lice. There's sewage everywhere. And when there was time for an offensive, the artillery bombardments went on for hours. If you can imagine the absolute closing of the fireworks at the 4th of July, multiply it by 2 or 3, and then have it go on for hours, and you're under that while that's happening, I don't know how people get through it. Artillery shells killed more soldiers than any other weapon during the war. That was once beautiful French or Belgian countryside. Meadows, fields, small villages, and it was turned into a complete wasteland. Technology came along to improve the methods of killing people. They got machine guns to the point that a machine gun could fire 10 bullets in 1 second. If you were attacking across no man's land facing a row of machine guns, your chances were obviously really poor. Well, that's helpful. Oh, well, we'll just pursue. Yes, it sort of sound what the machine gun might have sounded like, I suppose. Okay, another new weapon was the airplane. At first, they were used for reconnaissance. You know, you fly over the enemy side and see where their troops are positioned. But then people learned how to drop bombs from airplanes. And then one of the legends of the war, one of the romantic legends was this is the era of the flying ace with dogfights up in the sky. That is Baron von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who had 80 victories in plane-to-plane combat. When he was finally shot down over England, the British Army buried him with full military honors for their respect for how good he was. And then another miracle of modern technology is poison gas. They started with chlorine gas, then they went to something called phosphine, and then they went to sulfur mustard gas. It killed and injured thousands, but it turned out not to be a very useful weapon because as soon as the wind changed, what you had dropped on sent over in shells on the enemy starts blowing back to your side. And so they actually didn't use it all that often. But one of my grandfathers was in the war and got gassed and survived the war, but had stomach issues for the entire rest of his life. At least he was alive. A Belgian farm family nursed him back to health before he could return to the American lines. The painting on the bottom there, I had forgotten about this. John Singer Sargent painted that. Those are British soldiers staggering in a line. They've been blinded by the gas. And despite the lack of success, the generals are constantly just sending people over the line, over the top, and having them charge across no man's land to get mowed down. Between the machine guns and all the bombardment, dead bodies get buried everywhere. And so if you're digging a new trench, people were constantly coming across the dead bodies of people who had been killed there a little while earlier. This is such a slaughter that a French general, Pétain, said that really military strategy was a waste of time in this war. As he put it, success will come in the final analysis to the side which has the last man. That's how they're fighting. Now, on the Eastern Front, I'm sorry, that's dead bodies? Just everywhere. I don't know how they got used to it. They didn't try to remove everybody. It was just too much work. Now, on the Eastern Front, it wasn't exactly trench warfare. The Russians actually did better than expected. They got to the front. They pushed the Germans and Austrians back to that reddish line to the west of Warsaw. The Germans then counterattacked and reclaimed all their territory and got as far as that double gold line by 1917. You've got fighting there. You've got fighting between Austria and Italy. The northeast corner of Italy was completely bordered by Austria-Hungary. So there's fighting in several locations. They have 11 battles over the same river, back and forth over the Isonzo River on the east there. And some of the fighting took place in the Alps. And the photos of soldiers trying to get in position by climbing the mountains, that's what I tried to capture in some of the shots there. Terrible fighting. And then there was even Turkey, which got into the war and is best remembered for the Gallipoli campaign, where particularly Winston Churchill had the idea of you land British forces at Gallipoli, they march easily through Turkey, and then march up into Austria-Hungary from the south and can knock them out of the war. It was kind of a clever idea, but the British didn't count on how good the Turks would fight. I've actually been to Gallipoli. I don't know, has anybody been there? That cliff, that photo doesn't do it justice. These Australians in particular had to basically climb a cliff pretty much straight vertical while people were shooting down at them from the top. 200,000 men killed or wounded in all of that. Now, how did the war finally come to an end? That happened in 1918, mainly because the United States entered the war. Now, to begin with, President Woodrow Wilson urged the country to be completely neutral. As he put it, the United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action. But it wasn't as easy as that to stay neutral. Britain and the British had the best navy in the world. They impose a blockade so that food and materials can't get to Germany. And the Germans respond with submarines. They're going to start sinking the ships carrying supplies to Britain and France. I love it. This is a warning posted by the German embassy in the United States, advising people, if you're smart, you won't be sailing on any passenger ships from America to Europe because we might sink it. It's very polite the way it's written. The most famous of the ships sunk was the Lusitania, which the Germans sank in May 1915. A passenger ship close to the Irish coast when it got sunk. 1,200 people killed. And of course, in Britain and France and America, this sinking was denounced as a completely unprovoked slaughter on civilians. But the Lusitania was carrying 4 million rounds of ammunition for the British. It was both a passenger ship and a military supply ship. So even the sinking of the Lusitania did not deter Wilson at first. It was only in 1916, after a submarine sank a passenger ferry in the English Channel, that Wilson sent an ultimatum and the Germans backed off for the time being. Now, Wilson might have wanted to be neutral, but the American economy was most definitely not neutral. America's balance of trade changed enormously. We began supplying 40% of what the British, the French, and the Russians needed to conduct the war. U.S. bankers, led by J.P. Morgan, loaned $2.3 billion to England and France. With all that trade and all that money that England and France now owe America, America really had a huge financial incentive in making sure that Britain and France won the war. In 1916, that's where that's where a slide would have been if I had the final version. Sorry. In the election of 1916, Wilson barely won re-election over the governor of New York, Charles Evans Hughes. The Democrats' slogan was, "He kept us out of war." And that's, it worked barely. The Republicans were a very strong party in 1916, but Wilson got just enough. But keeping us out of the war after the election became impossible. The Allied blockade of ships heading to Germany was so complete that ordinary Germans were starving. They really had run out of food. They weren't growing enough, and they couldn't get anything imported. A doctor in Berlin estimated that 80,000 children starved to death in 1916. That's Berlin. The Germans decided this can't go on because our people are suffering too badly. We have got to win the war now. We have to win it quickly. And so they decided to go for a knockout blow against the Allies. And they really weren't worried about the United States because they didn't think we'd have much of an army, and they didn't think we could get it to Europe quickly at all. So they think they can win the war before we get there, and that they resume submarine warfare. They start sinking ships again. As soon as they did that in February 1917, Wilson breaks off diplomatic relations. He's still not quite ready to go to war. Okay, can we not do that? Please? Okay. Wilson's still hesitating, so the British decide to give him a push. The British have intercepted a telegram running from the German Foreign Office to the German ambassador in Mexico. And that's the actual telegram there in the upper right. It's all in code, but the British, okay, really, let's not do this. Please? Thank you. The British managed to decode it, and what it shows is that the Germans are trying to work out a plan to encourage Mexico to attack us if we enter the war. And the Germans are saying, we'll help you, and if you enter the war with us, you'll get back Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, the land you lost in 1848. And it was a true telegram from the German foreign minister. The British send this to Wilson, and Wilson's quite annoyed. He gets it, he publishes it, so there are some of the headlines. German U-boats keep on sinking American ships, and finally, at the beginning of April, Wilson decides he has no choice. He went to Congress on April 2nd, 1917, and gave one of the most effective speeches in American history. It would have been cool to be there. It's too bad there's not a tape of it. The world must be made safe for democracy. Lots of clapping. We, America, we have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. It is a fearful thing, he continued, to lead this great peaceful people into war, but the right is more precious than peace. And we shall fight to bring peace and safety to all nations and to make the world itself at last free. Okay, Wilson has turned this into a crusade to save democracy and to save, European civilization as he sees it. A few days later, as Wilson requested, Congress declares that a state of war exists. At the time, the United States Army had 125,000 men. That puts it on a par with Chile, in 1917. Chile not being considered a major military power in the world, and neither were we. They had so few rifles, some of the training centers, they were using broom handles for rifles as they did some of their drills. But over the course of the next year and a half, the government drafted 3 million men and started sending them to Europe. The first troops arrived just a few months later in June. General John Pershing, who had the wonderful nickname of Blackjack, was in charge of the American troops. You see them unloading, and the sight of all those Americans coming off the liners, the ocean liners, must have been quite encouraging to the British and the French. Now, a few months later, Wilson announces to the world what America is fighting for. And it was delivered as a series of points. Wilson had 14 of them. It was broadcast by radio all over the place, Europe, Latin America, the Far East. And this is, the progressive zeal to reform the world that was quite a big deal in America in the period, applies those concepts and that vision to the war effort. So I want to briefly look at what Wilson had in mind. open covenants of peace. What he basically meant by that was no secret deals. When this war is resolved, everybody will know what the treaties say. There won't be any hidden promises to people. Absolute freedom of trade and freedom of the seas. We don't want anybody interfering with somebody else's shipping. Arms reduction as much as possible. I love this one. The free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. Boy, what does that sound like? Of course, and Russia should get a chance to determine its own future. But by this point, the Bolsheviks have been in power like 2 months. And Wilson is basically saying, let's let them figure out what they're doing. They're not the concern of the rest of the world right now. Obviously, he wants the Germans out of Belgium and France, and that region of northeastern France is going to get returned, Alsace and Lorraine. Autonomous development for the peoples of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Independence for the Balkan states. An independent Poland. Let's put Poland back on the map. And then finally, his last and the most important for him was a League of Nations that would work together to guarantee the independence and territorial integrity of countries across the world. Wilson really dreamed, and he was like a Presbyterian minister in his heart, and really saw this as a chance, a crusade to rescue the world and rescue people from their own failings, and really thought his League of Nations could do it. The British and the French were not necessarily impressed by Wilson's 14 points. And in fact, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau said, and I wish I could do this with a good French accent, but I can't, Monsieur Wilson bores me with his 14 points. Why, God Almighty has only 10. Yeah, I did manage to find a laugh, even in all this. Yay. All right, so what happens in 1918? The Germans launch one final offensive. It doesn't get very far, and with the help of the Americans, who now have 1 million soldiers at the front, the Allies pushed past the Germans and pushed the Germans back to that reddish line right below the words Ardennes Forest. So suddenly, Britain, France, thanks to America, are now making progress. The Germans are being pushed back closer and closer to the German border. While this is happening, another 1 million Americans have landed in France and are on their way to the front. So the German military high command viewed this the way I imagine sometimes people see the end of a chess match. Even though you haven't lost your king, if you can see how the next moves are going to play out, you can tell who's going to win and who is not. And the German military realized with this happening and with more and more Americans endlessly coming, they were going to lose. And rather than fight to the bitter end, German military leaders persuaded German political leaders to ask for a ceasefire and an armistice. And it was signed on November 11th, 1918, in that railroad car in the upper left. It was a car used by one of the French generals for his headquarters. The Germans thought that they were getting an armistice based on the 14 points. And there's the photos of some of the people after they came out of the car and a painting of what it might have looked like when they signed it. Delirious people dancing and lots of headlines you can imagine. The human cost of this war, these figures are estimates because nobody knows for sure with so many people being blown to smithereens by artillery shells. America lost about 117,000 men killed, 200,000 wounded, but look at the figures for the European countries. I mean, altogether, nearly 10 million soldiers were killed. Over 21 million were seriously wounded. This is a war that wiped out a generation of young men in Europe and left many of the survivors without arms or limbs, with crutches, sitting on street corners, begging for money. You had a lot of very injured veterans after this war was over. And at the same time, the Spanish flu arrived. And between that and the fallout from the war fighting itself, well over 2 million civilians died in Europe in this period. You got a total of 12 million people dead, at least. Obviously, a slaughter on a scale that no one had seen before. So how are you going to make peace after all that? Wilson had been a really smart politician during his first term, but he made some big mistakes when it came to working out the peace treaty. He naturally decided he would lead the American delegation himself. He did not bring a single Republican with him, so that when things went sour, he couldn't say they supported me too. It was purely a Wilson effort. He assumed that he could persuade the other leaders in Europe to do what he wanted just because he was right and he was eloquent. And it did not help that the people of Paris treated him as a savior. I mean, look at the crowds as he is riding through the streets of Paris. That's him sitting next to the French president. Wilson is soaking it all in. The French president, Poincaré, is not looking nearly as excited. Now, partly because of Wilson's point about an adjustment of all colonial claims, dozens and dozens and dozens of countries sent representatives to Versailles for the peace talks. The place was mobbed. That Hall of Mirrors photo in the lower right there gives you some example or sense of what it might have looked like. But really, there were 4 people who were making the decisions: British Prime Minister Lloyd George, Wilson, French Premier Clemenceau, and Italian Premier Vittorio Orlando. Orlando was the junior partner. Italy had been on the winning side, but it hadn't contributed a whole lot. So it's really the big 3 there on the left that are making the decisions. Britain and France have very specific goals. You can imagine, they want to make Germany pay for the war. They want to grab all Germany's colonies throughout the world. And especially for France, they want to try to make it so that Germany can never make war again. Wilson, of course, his agenda is the League of Nations. And so what you find, and if you read the details of this, it's fascinating but also sort of tragic. Wilson keeps making compromises with Lloyd George and Clemenceau in order to secure their support for the League of Nations. The treaty was signed in June 1919. The Germans had been kept out of all of the discussions. They were invited into a room. They were handed the treaty and told to sign on the dotted line. They were shocked because, like I said, they thought they were getting a peace based on the 14 points. They did not. And we're going to go through some of the details of just how awful this treaty was for Germany in a few weeks. But while the negotiations were happening, Britain did not lift the blockade on food going to Germany. German civilians are still starving through all this. And so the German leaders, when they get the treaty, feel they have no choice. They have got to sign on the dotted line, even though the treaty requires Germany to accept complete responsibility for causing the war, which is nonsense. I mean, I tried to suggest the multiple factors at the beginning of the talk. Nevertheless, Germany had to take full blame, and they had to pay $12.5 billion to England and France as reparations. One When the treaty gets to the Senate here in America, the main focus was the League of Nations, and the Republican leader was Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, a very good buddy of Teddy Roosevelt. And Lodge was particularly worried about Article 10, which seemed to him to commit America to defending the current borders of all British and French colonies. And he didn't think we should be committed to something like that. You know, he didn't want any sort of commitment that would interfere with the ability of Congress to declare war as allowed under the Constitution. Wilson refused to make any changes. Wilson went on a 10,000-mile railroad tour giving speeches. And actually his tour was going really well until he had a serious stroke in September 1919. And he had to come back to Washington. This is really incredible. For the rest of his term, his wife and his absolute closest advisors were the President of the United States. They kept Wilson. Wilson was basically in bed in the White House. Occasionally, they'd prop him up, and for an hour, some representatives from Congress could come talk to him, but then they'd be ushered out. It's staggering they got away with it. The country did not know how incapacitated Wilson actually was. The Senate held 2 votes on the treaty, and both times the treaty lost. After the treaty was defeated, America headed into the 1920s trying not to pay much attention to Europe or world affairs. We didn't join the League. We didn't even join the World Court, which would seem like a fairly innocuous institution to be part of. America's response for the 20s was, show me the money. The one thing American businesses and the government cared about was making sure Britain and France paid back their debts. At the same time, because Britain and France wanted to make sure Germany paid the reparations amounts. Germany couldn't afford to do that, so Germany borrowed money from American banks in order to pay reparations, in order to pay Britain and France, who then sent the same money across the Atlantic to pay us for what they had borrowed. This is weird. I'm not making this up. This is really strange. That's what was happening from America's perspective. This is what the world was doing for us in the 1920s. There was a separate treaty with Austria-Hungary, and the map of Central Europe was totally transformed. Austria-Hungary is gone. Germany loses a good chunk of its territory. Poland is back on the map. Because Poland is otherwise landlocked, they carved out what was called the Polish Corridor, if you can see it. It's just to the left of the words East Prussia. So Poland had this little area, strip that it could use to get to the Baltic. And then there was a portion of Germany on the eastern side of it that was separate, East Prussia. And you can see many of the ethnic groups that I showed you earlier now have their own countries. The Czechs and Slovaks were put together. Hungary is now independent. Romania got a lot bigger. And the Croats, the Serbs, the Montenegrins, all of them were thrown into one country called Yugoslavia, which simply meant southern. The southern Slavs now have their own country. But you can't overestimate the importance of World War I or the devastation. It is it was a unprecedented disaster that nobody wanted. The chain of events that led Europe there, at any moment, somebody could have decided something different and it wouldn't have happened. And yet somehow the way it played out, you end up with this horrendous massacre. And it has, as we will see, a very destabilizing effect on the countries of Europe. It leads directly to the Russian Revolution and the end of the Tsar's government. It leads directly to fascism and Mussolini in Italy. It leads directly to the fall of democracy in Germany and the rise of the Nazis and Hitler. And I want to, without getting too philosophical, in a couple of minutes left, it's sort of a subject for another day, but on some level, this war really undermined people's, in Europe and in America, confidence in just how rational human beings really are. I mean, how could the best and the brightest of Europe, in the foreign offices of all those countries, how could they have ended up with this? And there was a real, it's hard to measure, and I don't know how to do it in a slide, a sense of disillusionment with the European civilization, in a sense, politics, the belief that humans are irrational. It's how do people survive? What do they do in the 1920s? A lot of them leave behind the stress and the horror and just enjoy themselves. You know, the roaring 20s in America, Weimar Germany, if you all can imagine the movie Cabaret. People in Germany under the Weimar government were having a good time in a rather decadent way. And that movie does a good job of it. In culture, there is a new emphasis on irrationality and spontaneity that appears in a lot of different senses. Surrealism in art, things that just don't make sense. You know, if you look at Salvador Dali paintings, you know, that's not a rational world that he's living in. Atonal music, you know, scrapping the sense of chord structure and harmony that Western Europe had used for centuries. And then in literature, you think, you know, in the 20s, you have the beginning of stream of consciousness writing, which is not how the rational mind works. But if you read Virginia Woolf or James Joyce, you're getting a much deeper sense of what goes on in our heads, far beyond, you know, the rational level at the top. Okay, so I want to give, in the interest of really ending this on a high note, I want to give the last word to a couple of poets. Ezra Pound, an American poet living a lot in Europe, he wrote in the early 20s that the best men of their generation had been slaughtered, quote, for an old bitch gone in the teeth, for a botched civilization. Like, Europe wasn't what it thought it was. Western Civ wasn't what we thought it was. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land from 1922 is kind of the classic expression of post-war disillusionment. But I want to quote from a different poem of Eliot's, The Hollow Men. Some of you are going to be familiar with where I'm going. That poem ends, "This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper." Okay. So, what fun. Thank you all for being here. Sorry about that, but next week we'll be doing the Russian Revolution and Stalin, and thank you all for coming.